The floorboards creaked under Sarah's swollen feet as she stepped into her grandmother's abandoned cabin for the first time since the funeral. Dust particles danced in the afternoon light, streaming through cracked windows, and the musty smell of decades-old secrets hung heavy in the air. She was 7 months pregnant and had only come to collect a few family heirlooms before selling the property. But something felt wrong about this place. Sarah had always been the family genealogist, obsessively tracking bloodlines and medical histories for her unborn child's sake. What she didn't know was that her grandmother had been keeping meticulous records too, hidden records that would shatter everything. Behind a loose panel in the bedroom wall, Sarah's trembling fingers discovered a metal box containing birth certificates with names she'd never heard, medical files dating back 50 years, and photographs of women who looked exactly like her, all of them pregnant, all of them connected to a local doctor whose practice had been mysteriously shut down decades ago. The ultrasound photo of her own baby slipped from her shaking hands as one terrifying question burned in her mind. What had really happened to all these women? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the scattered photographs on the dusty floor. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same angular jawline, the same green eyes, the same delicate hands resting protectively over rounded bellies. Some were black and white, clearly from decades past, while others showed the faded color tones of the 70s and 80s. She picked up one of the birth certificates with trembling fingers. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly smudged, but the details were clear enough. Baby girl Morrison, born August 15, 1962, father unknown. Attending physician Dr. Marcus Thorne. The name sent a chill down her spine. She'd never heard of Dr. Thorne, but his signature appeared on document after document in the metal box. Birth certificates, medical records, even what appeared to be payment receipts, all bearing his name, all connected to women who could have been her sisters. But as she continued sifting through the papers, that hope crumbled. The medical files contained detailed notes about pregnancies, deliveries, and something called Project Continuation. The handwriting was meticulous, clinical, with observations that made her stomach turn. Subject exhibits ideal physical characteristics for breeding program. Genetic markers confirm compatibility. Pregnancy proceeding as expected for Generation 4. Generation 4. The words made her blood run cold. One folder was thicker than the others, bound with a rubber band that snapped when she tried to remove it. Inside were photographs of babies, dozens of them, all tagged with numbers instead of names. Baby 47th, baby 52nd, baby 61st. Each photo was paperclipped to a detailed chart tracking development milestones, medical measurements, and something labeled genetic viability score. Sarah's hands shook so violently she could barely hold the papers. She thought of her own meticulously planned pregnancy, how she'd chosen her donor based on genetic compatibility, how she'd tracked every milestone in her baby book. The parallels were too disturbing to ignore. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in an oilcloth, she found a leather journal. Her grandmother's handwriting filled page after page, dates spanning from 1961 to just 2 months before her death. The entries started clinically, almost businesslike. Dr. Thorne confirms the program is ready to begin. The first subjects have been selected based on genetic profiles, payment received as promised. But as the years progressed, the tone changed. Doubt crept into the carefully controlled script. Another girl went missing after delivery. Dr. Thorne says she chose to leave, but her sister came asking questions. I don't like this. And later, the babies aren't being placed with families like he promised. Something's wrong. I've been such a fool. The final entry was dated just weeks ago. Sarah doesn't know. She can never know. But if something happens to me, someone has to stop this. The cabin holds all the evidence. God forgive me for what I've helped create. Sarah's vision blurred as tears mixed with panic. Her grandmother hadn't just known about whatever Dr. Thorne was doing. She'd been part of it. And now Sarah, 7 months pregnant and completely alone, had stumbled into the same web of secrets that had apparently been spinning for over 60 years. Outside, gravel crunched in the driveway. Sarah froze, listening to the sound of a car door slamming shut. Heavy footsteps approached the cabin's front porch. Someone knew she was here. The wooden steps groaned under Sarah's weight as she descended into the basement, her phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead. The musty smell of old wood and something else, something medicinal, filled her nostrils. She'd been putting off exploring down here for 3 days, but the cramped feeling in the cabin above had finally driven her to investigate every corner of her inheritance. The basement was larger than she'd expected, stretching beyond the footprint of the cabin itself. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, their contents a mystery that would have to wait. But it was the far wall that caught her attention, specifically the section where the stone foundation looked different, newer somehow. Sarah ran her fingers along the mortar, feeling the inconsistency in the texture. Her grandmother had been full of surprises. But this seemed odd even for Eleanor Blackwood, a woman who'd kept a loaded shotgun by her front door and grew herbs that could cure anything from insomnia to infected wounds. The light from her phone revealed something else, a thin vertical line in the stones barely visible unless you were looking for it. Sarah pressed against the wall, and to her amazement, a section swung inward with a soft click. She pulled the chain on the desk lamp, and warm yellow light flooded the space. The filing cabinets were labeled with years dating back to 1952. Sarah pulled open the nearest drawer, 1998, the year she was born, and found it packed with manila folders, each containing what appeared to be complete medical records. Her hands trembled as she opened the first file. The name at the top made her stomach lurch: Jennifer Martinez, age 16. The paperwork detailed a pregnancy, complete with prenatal visits, blood work, and ultimately a birth certificate for a baby girl named Maria. But it was the final document in the folder that made Sarah's blood run cold: an adoption certificate, signed by someone listed as Dr. E. Blackwood. Her grandmother had been a midwife, Sarah knew that much. But this looked like something more official, more clinical than the folk medicine Eleanor was known for in town. Sarah grabbed another file. Rebecca Chen, age 17, pregnant, delivered a baby boy named David. Another adoption certificate, another signature from Dr. E. Blackwood. File after file revealed the same pattern. Young women, all pregnant, all giving birth under her grandmother's care, and all signing away their children to adoptive families. The dates spanned decades, hundreds of cases stretching back to the 1950s. Sarah's legs felt weak as she sank into the desk chair. The baby inside her, just 12 weeks along, seemed to pulse with new significance. She'd come here to think about her own difficult decision, whether to keep the child or consider adoption. The father had made his feelings clear before disappearing entirely. He wanted nothing to do with a baby or with her. She opened the desk drawers, searching for some explanation. The bottom drawer contained something that made her breath catch, a ledger book filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting. Names, dates, and, most disturbing of all, monetary amounts. Large sums of money changing hands, payment records, and what appeared to be a complex network of contacts in major cities across the country. This wasn't just a midwifery practice. This was a business. Sarah flipped through the pages, her unease growing with each entry. Some notations were in a code she couldn't decipher, but others were clear enough. Premium placement, $15,000, express service, additional $5,000, special requirements met, $25,000. Her grandmother had been selling babies. The realization hit her like a physical blow. All those stories about Eleanor helping girls in trouble, all the respect she'd commanded in their small town as someone who helped women through difficult times, it had been a front for something far more sinister. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, making her jump. She'd lost track of time completely. The message was from Dr. Peterson, her obstetrician. "Sarah, please call me. We need to discuss your blood work results." She stared at the message, her mind reeling. Routine blood work, they'd said. Standard procedure. But standing in this hidden room, surrounded by decades of her grandmother's secrets, the timing felt ominous. Another buzz. "It's important we speak soon. There are some unusual markers we need to discuss." Sarah's free hand moved instinctively to her stomach. The baby seemed smaller suddenly, more fragile, as if her grandmother's sins could somehow reach across death to touch this new life. She looked around the room one more time, knowing she'd barely scratched the surface of what was hidden here. But Dr. Peterson's messages couldn't wait. Whatever family legacy she'd inherited, it was about to get more complicated. The dust had settled by morning, but Sarah's world remained utterly transformed. She sat cross-legged on the hidden room's wooden floor, surrounded by towers of yellow documents that seemed to mock her with their silence. Her grandmother's coffee mug, still stained and forgotten on the main room's table, felt like a relic from another lifetime. Sarah's trembling fingers traced the edges of a birth certificate dated 1987, her own birth year. But the name wasn't hers. Jennifer Ann Morrison, born July 15, 1987. The same date, the same hospital, the same attending physician who had delivered Sarah, according to her mother's stories. A chill ran down her spine as she compared the document to her own birth certificate, which she'd photographed on her phone the night before. Every detail matched except the name and parents listed. Where Sarah's certificate showed Margaret and Robert Chen as her parents, this one listed her grandmother, Eleanor Morrison, and a father whose name had been deliberately scratched out with black ink. She set the certificate aside and reached for another file, this one thick with medical records spanning decades. Eleanor's handwriting filled the margins, notes that grew increasingly frantic as the years progressed. "Baby switched at hospital," read one entry. "Must protect Sarah from the truth." Another note, dated just 3 months ago, "The Morrison bloodline cannot continue. She must never know." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where her own child grew. 18 weeks along, perfectly healthy according to her last ultrasound. But now doubt crept in like poison. What had her grandmother meant about the bloodline? The medical records painted a disturbing picture: multiple miscarriages in the Morrison family, genetic abnormalities, stillbirths, a pattern stretching back 4 generations, all carefully documented in Eleanor's meticulous handwriting. But it was the newspaper clipping paperclipped to the back of the file that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Local doctor under investigation for baby trafficking ring," read the headline from August 1987. Dr. William Hartford, the same physician listed on both birth certificates, had been accused of illegally selling newborns to wealthy families desperate for children. The investigation had been quietly dropped due to insufficient evidence, but Sarah could see the truth written in her grandmother's notes. Eleanor had bought her, stolen her from another family and raised her as her own granddaughter, creating an elaborate lie that even Sarah's supposed parents had believed. But why? What was so dangerous about Sarah's real heritage that Eleanor would go to such lengths? A loose photograph fell from between the medical files, a Polaroid of a young woman holding a newborn baby. The woman's face had been torn away, but Sarah recognized the hospital bracelet, the same one she'd seen in her own baby photos. Written on the back in faded blue ink, "Jennifer's first day." "May God forgive me for what I've done." Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from David. "How's the cabin cleanup going? Missing you and little Bean." She stared at the message, her husband's loving words now feeling like they belonged to someone else's life. How could she explain this? How could she tell him that everything about her identity was a lie? She stood shakily and walked to the small window, peering out at the forest that surrounded the cabin. Somewhere out there was her real family, probably still wondering what had happened to their daughter. Parents who might have spent 35 years searching for her, grieving for a child who had been stolen in the night by a desperate old woman and a corrupt doctor. But it was the medical implications that terrified her most. If the Morrison bloodline was cursed with genetic problems, what did that mean for her baby? She pulled out her phone and scrolled to her obstetrician's number, then hesitated. Dr. Martinez would want details, explanations. She'd want to run tests, ask questions that Sarah wasn't ready to answer. A sound from the main room made her freeze. Footsteps on the wooden porch, slow and deliberate. Sarah quickly gathered the most important documents and shoved them into her purse, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the main window, she glimpsed a figure in a dark coat examining the front door. She pressed herself against the hidden room's wall, barely breathing. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then twice. A rattling at the door handle confirmed her worst fears. Someone was trying to get in, someone who knew she was here. Her grandmother's final note, the one she'd found at the bottom of the document pile, echoed in her mind. They're watching. They know about the baby. Trust no one, not even family. The footsteps stopped directly outside the window where she'd been standing moments before. Sarah closed her eyes and placed both hands protectively over her belly, wondering if the sins of her grandmother's desperate choices were about to catch up with her and her unborn child. The medical records, scattered across the hidden room's floor, told a story that made Sarah's hands shake as she gathered them into neat piles. Each document bore the same letterhead: Dr. Helena Morrison, private practice. Her grandmother's name, but not as Sarah had ever known her. Growing up, Grandma Helena had been a retired seamstress who made the most incredible quilts and told stories about traveling with the circus in her youth. Never once had anyone mentioned medical school. Never once had Sarah seen a diploma on the walls or heard Helena reference any medical knowledge beyond basic first aid. Sarah picked up a birth certificate dated 1987. The mother's name was listed as Jennifer Walsh, age 16. The attending physician, Dr. Helena Morrison. The baby's name had been left blank, but someone had written Baby Girl Walsh in careful script across the top margin. Below that, in different handwriting, were the words placed: Morrison family, Minnesota. Her stomach lurched. Morrison family, Minnesota. That was where her own mother had grown up, an only child raised by distant relatives after her parents died in a car accident. At least, that's what Sarah had always been told. She fumbled through more certificates, her breathing becoming shallow. 1983, baby boy Chen. 1989, baby girl Rodriguez. 1991, baby boy Thompson. All with the same notation placed: Morrison family, followed by various states: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa. All within driving distance of this remote cabin. The implications crashed over her like a wave. Helena hadn't just been delivering babies. She'd been running some kind of unofficial adoption network, taking children from young mothers and placing them with families across the Midwest. But the word placed felt wrong somehow. Too clinical, too detached. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus: "Hope you're settling in okay. Call me later." She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain what she was finding? How could she tell him that everything about her family history might be a lie? Instead, she typed back, still unpacking, "Will call tonight." The lie came easily, which disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. She turned back to the documents, this time focusing on the medical records. These were different from the birth certificates, more detailed, more personal, patient intake forms with handwritten notes in Helena's careful script. But as Sarah read through them, her confusion deepened. The young women described in these files weren't just pregnant teenagers seeking help. They were runaways, girls with no family connections, no support systems, girls who had disappeared from their lives and ended up here, in this remote cabin, under Helena's care. One file made her pause. Maria Santos, age 15, admitted in 1990. The intake notes read, "Patient arrived malnourished and approximately 6 months pregnant. Claims to have been living on the streets for 3 months. No family contact, no identification. Appears grateful for shelter and care." But it was the final note that made Sarah's blood run cold. patient expressed desire to keep child, explained that this was not possible given circumstances. Patient became resistant to placement discussions, may require additional counseling. Additional counseling? What did that mean? Sarah flipped through more files, finding similar patterns. Young women, isolated and vulnerable, arriving at the cabin pregnant and alone. All of them eventually agreeing to give up their children. All of them disappearing from the records after delivery. She found a ledger book hidden beneath the files, its pages filled with Helena's meticulous handwriting. Dates, names and payments. Large sums of money changing hands. $10,000 for baby girl Santos, $15,000 for baby boy Chen, $20,000 for baby girl Rodriguez. Helena hadn't been running a charity, she'd been selling babies. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor among the scattered documents. Her grandmother, the woman who had taught her to sew, who had made her hot chocolate during thunderstorms, who had been the closest thing to a mother figure after Sarah's own mother died, had been running an illegal adoption ring. But there was something else, something that made her skin crawl as the realization dawned. All of these records were decades old, but they were hidden here, in this cabin that Helena had left to Sarah. Why? Why preserve evidence of something so damaging? Unless... Sarah scrambled to her feet and began searching more frantically through the papers. She was looking for something specific now, though she couldn't quite name what it was. A connection, a link between these old records and her own life. She found it in a manila envelope marked personal in Helena's handwriting. Inside was a single birth certificate, her mother's birth certificate. But the details were all wrong. The date was right, but the mother's name wasn't the aunt who had supposedly raised her. It was listed as Rachel Morrison, Helena's maiden name, and the father's name was blank. Sarah stared at the document, her hands trembling. Her mother hadn't been Helena's granddaughter through marriage. She had been Helena's daughter, which meant everything about Sarah's family history was a carefully constructed lie. The manila folder felt heavier than it should have as Sarah carried it to the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly. She'd spent the last hour methodically going through the hidden room, but this particular file had made her blood run cold. Her own name was written across the tab in her grandmother's familiar handwriting, along with a date from 15 years ago. She opened it slowly, revealing medical documents she'd never seen before. Blood tests, genetic screenings, and what appeared to be fertility assessments, all bearing her name and signature, though she had no memory of ever having these procedures done. The letterhead belonged to a clinic called Meridian Reproductive Services, located 3 hours away in Burlington. Sarah's breath caught as she found a letter dated just 2 months after her high school graduation. The formal language made little sense to her, filled with medical jargon about genetic markers and hereditary predisposition protocols. But one phrase stood out clearly: subject demonstrates optimal compatibility for continuation of bloodline preservation project. Subject, not patient, subject. She set the phone aside and continued reading. Another document, this one bearing her grandmother's signature, outlined something called a generational monitoring agreement. The clinical language was deliberately obscure, but Sarah began to piece together fragments that made her stomach churn. References to selective breeding protocols and maintaining genetic purity peppered the pages. At the bottom of the folder, she found photographs, black and white images of women who looked remarkably similar to her. The same dark hair, the same bone structure, the same delicate features. Each photo was labeled with a name and date spanning back to the 1940s. Her grandmother as a young woman, her great-grandmother. Women she'd never seen before but who shared her face with unsettling precision. The final photograph showed her own mother, pregnant and smiling, standing beside a man Sarah didn't recognize. It wasn't her father. This man was tall and lean, with sharp features and pale eyes that seemed to stare directly through the camera lens. On the back, someone had written, Generation 4, Successful Implementation. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where her own child was growing. the baby that had surprised both her and David with its conception despite years of trying unsuccessfully. The pregnancy that had seemed like a miracle. Now she wondered if it had been planned all along. She heard gravel crunching in the driveway and quickly shoved the documents back into the folder. Through the kitchen window, she saw an unfamiliar black sedan pulling up beside her car. A woman in a dark coat emerged from the driver's side, middle-aged, professional-looking, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Sarah's heart rate spiked. She grabbed the folder and rushed back to the hidden room, shoving it behind some of the other files before closing the panel and adjusting the bookshelf to hide the entrance. The knocking on the front door came just as she made it back to the kitchen. "Miss Chen?" The woman's voice was pleasant but carried an underlying authority. "My name is Dr. Elizabeth Crane. I believe you knew my colleague, Dr. Margaret Chen, your grandmother." Sarah opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain latch engaged. "I'm sorry, but my grandmother was retired. She didn't have colleagues." Dr. Crane smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "May I come in?" "I think there are some things about your family's medical history we should discuss, especially given your current condition." The blood drained from Sarah's face. There was no way this woman could know about her pregnancy unless— "How do you know I'm pregnant?" "Your grandmother kept meticulous records, Sarah. May I call you Sarah?" Dr. Crane's tone remained conversational, but something predatory lurked beneath the surface. She was very excited about this development. We all were. "We? The clinic has been monitoring your family line for several generations now. Your grandmother was a valued partner in our research." Dr. Crane glanced at her watch. "I really do think we should talk inside. There are some decisions that need to be made regarding your pregnancy, and time is becoming a factor." Sarah's mind raced. The medical files, the photographs, the references to genetic monitoring, it was all connected to this woman and whatever clinic she represented. And somehow they'd been watching her family for decades. "I think you should leave," Sarah said, moving to close the door. Dr. Crane placed her hand against the wood, preventing it from shutting. Her pleasant demeanor shifted slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "I'm afraid that's not really an option anymore, dear. Not now that you're carrying the next generation." The rain drummed against the cabin windows as Sarah spread the documents across her grandmother's kitchen table, creating a timeline that made her stomach churn. The earliest medical records dated back to 1952, when her grandmother Elena would have been just 17. Each subsequent decade revealed another layer of the truth Sarah was beginning to piece together. Her hands trembled as she opened Elena's journal again, this time reading past the first shocking entry. The cramped handwriting told a story of desperate young women arriving at the cabin in the dead of night, their bellies round with unwanted pregnancies. Elena had served as both midwife and guardian of secrets, delivering babies that were immediately whisked away to families who could pay handsomely for the privilege of no questions asked. Mrs. Henderson's daughter arrived tonight, read one entry from 1967. 16 years old and terrified. The father is her stepfather, though we'll list it as unknown. The Weatherby family has already wired payment. They're expecting a healthy boy. Sarah's coffee grew cold as she read entry after entry, each one documenting a life forever altered within these very walls. The birth certificates were falsified, listing Elena as the attending physician despite her having no medical degree. The money trail was meticulously recorded in a separate ledger, thousands of dollars flowing through her grandmother's accounts, enough to explain how a woman with no apparent income had maintained the cabin and left Sarah a substantial inheritance. But it was the section marked special cases that made Sarah's blood run cold. These weren't desperate teenagers or women fleeing abusive relationships. These were planned pregnancies, carefully orchestrated genetic experiments disguised as compassionate acts. She found her mother's name buried in a 1978 entry, Margaret, subject 23, artificially inseminated with donor 7, subject unaware of true paternity, cover story, brief relationship with traveling salesman, expected delivery March 1979. Sarah calculated quickly. March 1979 was exactly 9 months before her own birth. This entry wasn't about her mother having her. This was about her mother being conceived. Her grandmother hadn't just facilitated illegal adoptions. She'd been breeding people. Sarah rushed to the hidden room, pulling down boxes she hadn't yet examined. In the third box, she found what she was looking for, a folder marked genetic tracking, bloodline preservation. Inside were detailed family trees, not of the women who came to the cabin, but of the children they produced. Her grandmother had been tracking genetic traits across generations, documenting everything from eye color to intelligence markers to specific medical conditions. At the center of the largest family tree was a name that made Sarah's knees buckle, Dr. Marcus Kane, 1923 to 1987. She knew that name. Every pregnant woman in the tri-state area knew that name. Dr. Marcus Kane had been a fertility specialist, a pioneer in reproductive medicine who'd helped hundreds of couples conceive. His clinic had been shut down in 1987 amid rumors of unethical practices, but he'd been lauded as a hero by most of his former patients. According to Elena's records, Dr. Kane hadn't just been a client, he'd been the orchestrator. The cabin had served as his off-the-books laboratory, a place where he could conduct experiments that would never pass medical review boards. Elena had been his partner, using her isolated location and the desperation of pregnant women to further his research into genetic manipulation. Sarah found her own medical file in the bottom of the box. Unlike the others, this one was thick, filled with prenatal records she'd never seen before. Records that showed her grandmother had been monitoring her pregnancy from the very beginning, taking blood samples during their monthly visits under the guise of checking her vitamin levels. The truth hit her like a physical blow. Her baby wasn't just her baby. It was the culmination of 3 generations of genetic planning, carefully orchestrated by a man who'd been dead for over 30 years, but whose influence still reached into her womb. She flipped to the final page of her file and found a note in Elena's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before her death. Subject 47 shows optimal markers. Kane's vision will finally be realized. The child must be protected at all costs. Sarah cannot know the truth until after delivery. But there was more. Clipped to the note was a bank routing number and an account balance that made Sarah gasp. $5 million earmarked for post-delivery care and subject relocation. Someone was still funding this nightmare. Someone who expected her to disappear after her baby was born, just like all the other women who'd passed through these walls. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Williams, her obstetrician. Lab results came back clean. "See you next week for your ultrasound. Everything looks perfect." She stared at the message, realizing now that nothing about her pregnancy had been left to chance. Even her choice of doctor had likely been orchestrated. Outside, the rain intensified, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in the cabin anymore. The rain hammered against the cabin windows as Sarah spread the remaining documents across the kitchen table, her hands trembling with each revelation. The medical records painted a horrifying picture that made her stomach churn with more than morning sickness. Generation after generation of women in her family had given birth to children with severe developmental disabilities, stillbirths, and genetic anomalies that defied explanation. Sarah's phone buzzed against the wooden surface. Michael's name flashed on the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. How could she explain that their unborn child might be part of some twisted genetic experiment that had claimed her mother, her grandmother, and countless other women in her bloodline? A leather-bound journal caught her attention, wedged between 2 manila folders. The cover was worn smooth, and when she opened it, her grandmother's familiar handwriting filled the yellowed pages. The first entry was dated just 3 months before her death. Sarah's vision blurred as she read on, learning how her great-grandmother had been recruited by Dr. Edmund Blackwood in 1962, promised that her pregnancy would be monitored by the finest medical minds. Instead, she'd been injected with experimental compounds, her blood drawn weekly, and her child, Sarah's grandfather, born with severe cognitive impairments that plagued him his entire short life. The pattern repeated with each generation. The Blackwood Institute, disguised as a prestigious fertility clinic, had targeted women from isolated communities, women who wouldn't be missed if something went wrong. They documented genetic modifications, hormone treatments, and experimental procedures that violated every ethical boundary imaginable. The cabin was supposed to be our safe haven, her grandmother had written. But Edmund's son, Dr. James Blackwood, found us even here. He convinced your mother that her pregnancy complications were hereditary, that only his treatment could save you. She trusted him, and it killed her. Sarah's mother hadn't died from natural complications during childbirth. She'd been murdered by experimental drugs designed to test the limits of human genetic manipulation. And now, somehow, the same hands that had destroyed her family were reaching for her unborn child. A photograph slipped from between the journal pages, landing face up on the table. Sarah recognized Dr. James Blackwood immediately. The same kind eyes and reassuring smile from the website of the Riverside Medical Center, where she'd been receiving her prenatal care, where Dr. James Blackwood was listed as the head of the obstetrics department. The room spun as the realization hit her. Her pregnancy hadn't been a happy accident. She'd been selected, tracked, and guided into his care just like every woman before her. The fertility issues that had plagued her for years, the miraculous conception after visiting Riverside Medical Center for a routine consultation, the insistence on specific blood tests and procedures, it was all part of their plan. Thunder crashed overhead, and through the storm, Sarah heard the distinct sound of a car engine struggling up the muddy mountain road. Her blood turned to ice as headlights swept across the cabin windows, illuminating the documents spread across her table like damning evidence. She quickly gathered the papers, shoving them back into the hidden room as footsteps approached the front door. The knock was gentle, almost caring, but Sarah recognized it as the sound of predator announcing itself to prey. "Sarah, it's Dr. Blackwood. I was worried when you missed your appointment today." His voice carried the same warm authority that had made her trust him completely just days ago. Now it sounded like poison wrapped in silk. "I know you're in there, Sarah. Your car is outside and I can see the lights. I'm here to help you, just like I helped your mother." Sarah pressed her back against the hidden door, praying the mechanism wouldn't give her away. Through the crack beneath the main door, she could see his shadow moving back and forth on the porch. "The mountain roads are dangerous in this weather, especially for pregnant women. Why don't you let me drive you back to town? We can discuss your treatment plan." Treatment plan. The same words that had doomed her mother and grandmother. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, protecting the life growing inside her from the monster on her doorstep. "I know about the records, Sarah. I know what you found." The gentle facade dropped from his voice, replaced by cold calculation. "But you don't understand the bigger picture yet. Your family's sacrifice has contributed to groundbreaking research that will change the future of human evolution. Your child could be the culmination of 60 years of careful genetic refinement." The basement felt different in the morning light filtering through the small, dust-covered windows. Sarah had barely slept, her mind churning through the implications of what she'd discovered. Dr. Marcus Holloway, the connection between her grandmother and the man conducting illegal experiments, felt like a noose tightening around her throat. She spread the documents across the cabin's kitchen table, organizing them chronologically. The earliest papers dated back to 1962, just after her grandmother Helen had married her grandfather. But these weren't the warm family records Sarah had expected to find. Instead, they painted a picture of a woman deeply involved in something sinister. Her phone buzzed. A text from David. "Haven't heard from you. Everything okay at the cabin?" She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain that everything she thought she knew about her family was crumbling? That the baby growing inside her might be connected to decades-old experiments? Fine. Just going through grandmother's things. Need more time. Sarah turned back to the documents, pulling out a folder marked Subject Profiles, Generation 2. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were detailed medical records for women, all between the ages of 18 and 35. The notes were clinical, detached, describing hormone levels, genetic markers, and something called embryonic manipulation protocols. One name made her blood freeze: Rebecca Chen. Sarah knew that name. Rebecca had been her mother's best friend in college, the woman who'd introduced her parents. According to family law, Rebecca had died in a car accident when Sarah was 5, but according to these documents, Rebecca had been part of Holloway's program. The file contained photos of Rebecca during what appeared to be pregnancy, along with detailed notes about genetic enhancement procedures and controlled environmental factors. The final entry in Rebecca's file was dated 3 days before her supposed accident. The handwriting was Helen's, subject showing signs of non-compliance, threatening exposure, recommend immediate intervention. Sarah's stomach lurched. She rushed to the bathroom, barely making it before she was violently sick. When the nausea passed, she sat on the cold tile floor, her back against the wall, trying to process what she'd read. Her grandmother hadn't just been involved in the experiments. She'd been instrumental in silencing those who threatened to expose them. Back in the kitchen, Sarah found another folder, this one labeled Generation 3, Current Status. Her heart hammered as she opened it, expecting to find her own name. Instead, she found something worse. The folder contained surveillance photos of her and David, pictures taken outside their apartment, at the grocery store, at her doctor's appointments. Someone had been watching them for months, documenting her pregnancy with the same clinical detachment as the earlier subjects. At the bottom of the pile was a letter addressed to Helen, dated just 2 weeks before her death. The letterhead read Holloway Medical Research Foundation. Apparently, the doctor's work had continued long past his supposed death in 1987. Mrs. Patterson, the letter began, we are pleased to confirm that Subject 3A has successfully conceived. Initial genetic markers indicate optimal conditions for the continuation of the enhanced bloodline. Please maintain surveillance protocols and ensure subject compliance through term. Payment will be transferred upon successful delivery and specimen collection. Sarah's vision blurred. Subject 3A. That was her. Her pregnancy wasn't a happy accident. It was planned, monitored, orchestrated by people who saw her as nothing more than a breeding vessel for their sick experiments. The letter was signed by someone named Dr. Elena Vasquez, with a phone number and an address in Portland, less than 2 hours away. Sarah's phone rang, startling her. David's name appeared on the screen. She let it go to voicemail, then immediately played the message. Sarah, I'm getting worried. Your last text seemed off. I'm thinking about driving up there. Call me back, okay? Sarah gathered the most damning documents and stuffed them into her purse. She needed answers, and there was only one place to get them. Dr. Elena Vasquez was going to explain exactly what they'd done to her, what they wanted from her baby, and how deep this conspiracy ran. As she prepared to leave, Sarah caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. She looked pale, haunted, but there was something else in her eyes she hadn't seen before, a fierce determination. They'd manipulated her, used her, treated her like a lab rat. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated her. Sarah locked the cabin and headed for her car, Dr. Vasquez's address burning in her mind. The confrontation couldn't wait. The pregnancy test slipped from Sarah's trembling fingers, clattering onto the bathroom floor of the cabin. 2 pink lines stared back at her, confirming what her body had been telling her for weeks. But instead of joy, a cold dread settled in her stomach as Dr. Brennan's words echoed in her mind. And the genetic markers in your family line are quite unique. She pressed her back against the bathroom door, sliding down until she sat on the cold tiles. The hidden room's revelations crashed over her in waves. Her grandmother hadn't just been documenting births. She'd been tracking something specific, something that ran in their bloodline. And now Sarah carried that same blood, that same genetic legacy in the life growing inside her. A sharp knock at the front door jolted her from her spiraling thoughts. Sarah quickly gathered herself, shoving the pregnancy test into her jacket pocket as she made her way through the cabin. Through the window, she could see a woman in her 50s standing on the porch, wearing a long wool coat despite the autumn warmth. "Sarah Winters?" the woman asked when Sarah opened the door. Her voice carried the same clinical precision Sarah remembered from their brief phone conversation. "I'm Dr. Patricia Brennan. We spoke yesterday." Sarah's grip tightened on the door handle. "You said you knew my grandmother. May I come in? What I have to tell you isn't something we should discuss on the porch." Dr. Brennan's grey eyes held an urgency that made Sarah's skin crawl, but she stepped aside nonetheless. The doctor's gaze immediately swept the cabin's interior, lingering on the basement door that Sarah had left slightly ajar. "Have you found anything unusual since we last spoke?" "That depends on your definition of unusual." Sarah closed the door but remained standing, unwilling to make this visit comfortable. "You said you had answers about the medical records." Dr. Brennan set down a leather briefcase and opened it with deliberate movements. "Your grandmother was part of a research study that began in the 1950s, a longitudinal genetic study tracking inherited traits across multiple generations." She pulled out a thick manila folder. Initially, it was legitimate research into hereditary diseases. The parameters changed in the 1970s. The focus shifted from preventing genetic disorders to enhancing certain traits. Dr. Brennan's voice grew quieter. "Your grandmother became concerned about the direction of the research. She started keeping her own records, documenting what was really happening to the families involved." Sarah felt the pregnancy test's weight in her pocket like a lead stone. "What kind of traits?" "Intelligence, physical resilience, sensory acuity." The researchers believed they could identify and cultivate superior genetic lines. Dr. Brennan opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents, but there were side effects, complications that weren't anticipated. The doctor handed Sarah a black and white photograph. It showed a young woman holding an infant, both looking normal except for the baby's eyes. They seemed to reflect light like an animal's. "The enhanced traits came with a price," Dr. Brennan continued. "Heightened aggression, sensory overload, and, in some cases, severe psychological breaks. Your grandmother tried to pull her family line out of the study, but by then the genetic markers were already established." Sarah's mouth went dry. "How many generations?" "At least 3. The traits can skip generations or manifest differently." Dr. Brennan studied Sarah's face carefully. "Have you experienced any unusual symptoms lately? Enhanced senses, mood swings, strange dreams?" The room seemed to tilt. Sarah had attributed her recent hypersensitivity to stress, but now she remembered how she'd been able to hear conversations from impossible distances, how bright lights had become painfully intense, how her dreams had been filled with violent, primitive urges she'd never experienced before. "The pregnancy hormones can trigger dormant genetic expressions," Dr. Brennan said softly, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. "Your grandmother's records suggest the traits are strongest in pregnant women." "How did you know I was pregnant?" Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. She pulled out a syringe and a small vial filled with clear liquid. "There's a treatment. It can suppress the genetic expressions, return your body chemistry to normal ranges, but it has to be administered within the first trimester." Sarah backed away from the syringe. "What aren't you telling me?" Dr. Brennan's professional mask slipped slightly. "The treatment stops the genetic enhancements, but it also—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "It terminates any pregnancy." The cabin fell silent, except for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers demanding entry. The pregnancy test in her pocket felt heavier with each passing second, and somewhere deep in her mind, Sarah could swear she heard her grandmother's voice whispering warnings she was only now beginning to understand. The pregnancy test clattered to the bathroom floor as Sarah's hands began to shake. 2 pink lines, positive. The timing couldn't be more devastating or more terrifying. She sank onto the edge of the bathtub, her mind racing through the medical records she discovered just hours earlier, the genetic markers, the inherited conditions, the pattern of complications that had plagued the women in her family for generations. Her grandmother's notes had been clinical, detached, but the implications were anything but cold. Recurrent neural tube defects in 73% of pregnancies, spina bifida prevalence 8 times normal population. Recommendation: genetic counseling mandatory before conception. The words burned in her memory. Her grandmother had known, had documented everything, had kept meticulous records of a family curse that Sarah was only now beginning to understand. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Sarah, you've been in there a while?" David's voice carried concern, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. How could she tell him? How could she explain that the child they might be carrying could face a lifetime of challenges because of secrets buried in dusty medical files? She picked up the test, staring at those damning pink lines. In the hidden room, she'd found birth certificates for babies who had lived only days, medical reports detailing surgeries and interventions, photographs of children in wheelchairs and hospital beds, all bearing the family resemblance, all carrying the genetic burden that had been passed down like a twisted heirloom. "I'm fine," she called out, though her voice cracked on the words. "Just give me a minute." Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez, the geneticist she'd contacted after finding the records. "Can meet tomorrow 2 p.m. if urgent. Brought your grandmother's files to review?" Sarah's thumb hovered over the keyboard. She'd sent those photos of the medical records in a moment of desperation, hoping for answers. Now she had to decide whether she wanted to hear them. "Yes, we'll be there." She stood, legs unsteady, and opened the bathroom door. David was leaning against the hallway wall, his dark eyes immediately scanning her face for clues. "What's wrong?" His question was gentle but direct. They'd been together long enough that he could read her moods like weather patterns. "We need to talk." The words felt inadequate, but she couldn't think of any others. "How did you tell someone that the family they thought they knew was built on carefully concealed medical tragedies?" They sat on the cabin's worn couch, the same one where she'd found some of the hidden files tucked beneath loose cushions. The irony wasn't lost on her. This place that should have been a sanctuary was revealing itself to be a repository of family secrets. "I found something else," she began, then stopped. The pregnancy test was still clutched in her hand, but the genetic revelations felt more immediate somehow. "My grandmother, she kept records, medical records, about our family." David's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "What kind of records?" Sarah reached for the manila folder she'd brought from the hidden room. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing decades of documentation that painted a picture of hereditary medical issues spanning 4 generations. "Birth defects," she said quietly. "Neural tube defects, specifically. Running through the maternal line. My great-grandmother, my grandmother's sisters, cousins I never knew existed." She pulled out a photograph of a young woman holding a baby with visible spinal abnormalities. "This is my great-aunt Margaret. I never knew she existed because the family, they hid these children." David's face paled as he studied the documents. "Sarah, this is... Why didn't anyone tell you? Because they were ashamed, or scared. Or maybe they thought if they didn't talk about it, it would stop happening." She set down the folder and finally held up the pregnancy test. "But it's not going to stop, and we need to know what we're facing." The silence that followed felt enormous. David stared at the test, then at the medical files, then back at her face. She could see him processing, calculating, trying to understand the magnitude of what she'd discovered. "How long have you known?" he asked finally. "About the pregnancy?" 5 minutes. "About the genetic issues?" "Since this morning." She leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I have an appointment with a geneticist tomorrow. We need to know the risks, need to understand what this means for us." David's arm tightened around her. "We'll figure this out. Whatever this is, whatever we're facing, we'll handle it together." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. They were stepping into uncharted territory, armed with devastating family history and facing impossible choices. The sound of tires crunching on gravel jolted Sarah from her restless sleep on the cabin's worn couch. Through the frost-covered window, she watched a black sedan emerge from the tree line, moving with deliberate slowness down the narrow drive. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the government plates. Dr. Chen hadn't been lying about making calls. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly as she stood, the manila folder of damning evidence clutched in her other hand. The baby kicked as if sensing her distress, a reminder of everything at stake. She'd spent the sleepless night poring over the documents again, hoping to find some explanation that didn't lead to the terrifying conclusion forming in her mind. The car doors slammed shut with military precision. Two figures approached the cabin, a tall woman in a charcoal coat and a younger man whose sharp eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of the property. Sarah's throat tightened. These weren't local officials. A firm knock echoed through the cabin. "Miss Mitchell? Agent Rebecca Torres, CDC. We need to speak with you." Sarah's legs felt unsteady as she approached the door. Through the peephole she could see the woman's badge held prominently in view, its gold emblem catching the morning light. There was no avoiding this conversation. "What do you want?" Sarah called through the door, buying herself precious seconds to think. "We understand you've discovered some historical medical records that may be related to an ongoing federal investigation." The words hit Sarah like ice water. Federal investigation. Whatever her grandmother had been involved in was far larger than she'd imagined. She opened the door but kept the chain latch engaged, creating a narrow gap. "I don't know what you're talking about." Agent Torres smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Miss Mitchell, we're not here to cause trouble. But those documents you found, they're part of a classified research program that was shut down decades ago. For public safety reasons, we need to ensure they're properly secured." "Classified research?" Sarah's voice cracked despite her effort to stay calm. "What kind of research?" The male agent stepped forward. "Agent Martinez, CDC Epidemic Intelligence Service. May we come in? This conversation is sensitive in nature. I want to see more identification first." Both agents produced leather credentials, holding them steady for her inspection. Everything appeared legitimate, from the holographic seals to their professional demeanor. Sarah's hands trembled as she unlatched the chain. They entered with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to compliance. Agent Torres immediately noticed the scattered papers on the coffee table, her gaze lingering on the visible medical charts. "Miss Mitchell, what we're about to tell you is classified, but given your condition and your family's history, you have a right to know." Torres gestured toward the couch. "Please, sit down." Sarah remained standing, the folder pressed against her chest like armor. "My condition?" "Your pregnancy." Martinez consulted a tablet he'd produced from his jacket. "Conceived approximately 6 months ago, correct? Have you experienced any unusual symptoms? Accelerated development, perhaps? Heightened physical capabilities?" The question struck too close to home. Sarah had noticed changes. Her stamina during pregnancy was remarkable, her recovery from morning sickness unusually quick, her baby's development consistently ahead of schedule. She'd attributed it to good genetics. "How do you know about my pregnancy?" "Dr. Chen contacted us after your visit yesterday," Torres explained. "She was required to report any potential exposure to Project Nightingale subjects or their descendants." Project Nightingale. The name felt foreign on Sarah's tongue, yet somehow familiar. Martinez scrolled through his tablet. "A genetic research program conducted from 1952 to 1967. Your grandmother Eleanor Mitchell was a subject in the final phase, trials involving genetic modification of reproductive cells. The program was terminated when researchers discovered unintended consequences in subsequent generations." Sarah's knees buckled. She sank onto the couch, the folder sliding from her numb fingers. "Genetic modification?" "The modifications were designed to enhance immune response and cellular regeneration," Torres continued, her tone clinical. "But they proved heritable in unpredictable ways. Some subjects' children and grandchildren exhibited enhanced abilities. Others—" She paused meaningfully. Others experienced complications during pregnancy and childbirth. What kind of complications? The agents exchanged glances. Martinez cleared his throat. In some cases, the enhanced genetic material proved incompatible with normal human physiology. The pregnancies progressed rapidly, sometimes violently. The infants were often, he struggled for the right words, different. Sarah's world tilted sideways. Every kick from her baby now felt ominous, every moment of unusual wellness a warning sign. "Are you saying my baby isn't human?" "We're saying," Torres replied carefully, "that we need to monitor your pregnancy very closely, for everyone's safety." The threat beneath her words was unmistakable. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the medical record that bore her name, a record that shouldn't exist. According to the date, it had been created 3 months before she'd even met Dr. Hendricks, before she'd known she was pregnant. The clinic letterhead matched perfectly with where she'd been receiving her prenatal care. The basement felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as she rifled through more documents. Every breath seemed labored, the musty air thick with secrets that had been buried for decades. She found another file folder, this one marked with her mother's name and a date from 1985, the year Sarah was born. Inside were photographs, black and white medical photographs that made her stomach lurch. Women in hospital beds, their faces obscured, but their conditions clearly documented. Handwritten notes in the margins described optimal breeding conditions and genetic compatibility assessments. The clinical language couldn't mask the horror of what she was reading. Her phone buzzed. Marcus again. She'd been down here for hours, and the outside world felt like a distant memory. She couldn't answer, not yet. Not until she understood what she'd stumbled into. A loose floorboard creaked overhead. Sarah froze, listening. Another creak, deliberate and heavy. Someone was in the cabin. She quickly gathered the most damning documents, shoving them into her jacket. The footsteps moved across the living room floor, slow and searching. Whoever it was knew the layout well. They weren't stumbling around like an intruder might. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Marcus wouldn't just show up without calling. Her mother was in the city. Dr. Hendricks had seemed genuinely surprised when she'd mentioned the cabin, but that could have been an act. The whole concerned physician routine could have been expertly crafted. The footsteps stopped directly above her. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself against the stone wall. A door opened. The bedroom, then another. They were searching for something, or someone. She needed to get out, but the basement's only exit led directly into the kitchen. If she tried to leave now, she'd walk straight into whoever was up there. Her eyes swept the basement again, looking for another way out. In the far corner, behind a stack of mouldering boxes, she noticed something she'd missed before, a small window, partially concealed by decades of grime and neglect. The footsteps moved toward the kitchen. Sarah heard the basement door rattle. She scrambled toward the window, pushing boxes aside as quietly as possible. The window was old, painted shut, but the wood frame had rotted enough that she might be able to force it. She pressed her shoulder against it and pushed. Behind her, the basement door opened. Light spilled down the wooden stairs, followed by cautious footsteps. The window gave way with a soft crack. Sarah squeezed through the narrow opening, emerging into the tall grass behind the cabin. She could hear movement in the basement now, boxes being shifted, papers rustling. Whoever it was had found her hiding place. She crept around the side of the cabin, staying low. A black sedan sat in the driveway, not a car she recognized. Through the kitchen window, she caught a glimpse of a figure moving in the basement, medium height, wearing dark clothes. The angle made it impossible to identify them. Sarah made it to her car and slowly opened the driver's door, praying the interior light wouldn't give her away. She slipped inside and quietly closed the door. Her hands shook as she inserted the key, turning it as gently as possible. The engine started with what sounded like a roar, but was probably no louder than usual. She backed out of the driveway without turning on her headlights, using only the pale moonlight to navigate. Only when she reached the main road did she flip on the lights and accelerate. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from Marcus and 3 from her mother. There was also a text from Dr. Hendrix's office, reminding her about an appointment she'd never scheduled. The appointment was for tomorrow morning. Everything was connected. The medical records, her pregnancy, the clinic, it was all part of something larger and more sinister than she'd imagined. Her grandmother hadn't just been documenting someone else's crimes. She'd been part of it, and now Sarah was trapped in the same web. She needed help, but who could she trust? Marcus seemed genuine, but she'd thought the same about Dr. Hendrix. Her mother had been lying to her for months, possibly years. Even her own medical care had been compromised. As she drove through the darkness toward town, Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly. Whatever was growing inside her, whatever procedures she'd unknowingly undergone, the people responsible weren't going to let her simply walk away. They'd been planning this too long, invested too much. The documents in her jacket felt like they were burning against her chest, evidence of decades of systematic abuse, and she was carrying the latest chapter of that story inside her own body. The drive back to the cabin felt like descending into a nightmare. Sarah's hands trembled on the steering wheel as Dr. Martinez's words echoed in her mind. The genetic marker, the same one found in 3 generations of women in her family, the same one that had been systematically documented in those meticulous records hidden beneath her grandmother's floorboards. She pulled into the gravel driveway as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and greys. The cabin looked different now, more sinister somehow, its windows like dark eyes keeping watch. Sarah sat in the car for several minutes, one hand instinctively moving to her belly where her baby grew, carrying that same cursed genetic signature. Inside, she went straight to the hidden room. The medical files were exactly where she'd left them, scattered across the makeshift desk like evidence at a crime scene. She picked up her mother's file again, reading more carefully this time. Her mother had been part of Dr. Henley's study too, though she'd apparently withdrawn from it during her second trimester. There was a note in Henley's handwriting. Subject became uncooperative after learning true nature of research. Recommend enhanced monitoring through alternative channels. Alternative channels. Sarah's blood ran cold. Had her grandmother been one of those channels? Had she been reporting on her own daughter? The next file made her stomach lurch. It contained photographs, ultrasound images that looked wrong somehow, the shapes unclear and disturbing. At the bottom of each photo was a date and a name she didn't recognize, but the genetic marker notation was the same as hers. These weren't normal pregnancy scans. These looked like something from a horror movie. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Found something. Meet me at the diner tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Come alone. Sarah stared at the message. Marcus had been investigating Dr. Henley's research, but she hadn't heard from him in days. Part of her felt relief that he'd found something, but another part wondered why he was being so cryptic. Why insist she come alone? She spent the night poring over more files, finding connections that made her sick. Dr. Henley hadn't just been studying genetic anomalies, he'd been trying to enhance them. The research notes spoke of accelerated development and enhanced capabilities in ways that made it sound less like medical research and more like some twisted breeding program. The worst part was finding her grandmother's own medical records. Eleanor hadn't just been an observer or assistant, she'd been a test subject too, decades earlier. Her pregnancy with Sarah's father had been monitored, documented, manipulated. The notes indicated that Eleanor's baby had been successfully modified before birth. Sarah's hands shook as she read the implications. Her father hadn't just carried a genetic anomaly, he'd been deliberately altered in utero, which meant Sarah herself was the product of that modification. And now her own baby, she couldn't finish the thought. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the diner early, choosing a booth in the back corner where she could watch the entrance. Marcus arrived precisely at 9, sliding into the seat across from her. He looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and stubble covering his jaw. "You look terrible," Sarah said. "You should see the other guy." Marcus attempted a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah, what I found, it's worse than we thought. Dr. Henley's research didn't end when he died. It was continued by a group of his former colleagues. They've been tracking the families involved in his original studies. Tracking them how? Marcus pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. Medical records, birth certificates, insurance claims. They've been monitoring every pregnancy in those bloodlines for the past 30 years, including yours. Sarah opened the folder with numb fingers. Inside were copies of her own medical records, dating back to her very first prenatal appointment. Someone had been watching her, documenting her pregnancy from the beginning. Red ink notations filled the margins, marking specific dates and measurements. "Who's doing this?" she whispered. "That's the million-dollar question. The trail leads to a private research foundation called the Helix Institute. On paper, they study genetic disorders, but I think they're continuing Henley's work." And Sarah, Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I think your grandmother was still working with them when she died." The diner suddenly felt too warm, too small. Sarah's vision blurred around the edges as the full weight of the betrayal hit her. Eleanor hadn't just hidden the truth about the past, she'd actively participated in whatever was happening to Sarah's pregnancy. "There's more," Marcus continued. "The other women in those files, the ones with the same genetic marker, 3 of them gave birth in the last 5 years. All 3 babies disappeared from the hospital within days of delivery. The official reports claim stillbirth or medical complications, but I found evidence suggesting the babies were taken alive." Sarah's world tilted sideways. They weren't just studying the babies, they were stealing them. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the final document, the one that made everything else fall into place with horrifying clarity. It wasn't a medical record or birth certificate this time. It was a letter, written in her grandmother's careful script and dated just 3 months before her death. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have found what I prayed you never would, but knew someday you must. The weight of our family's sins has grown too heavy for one old woman to bear alone." The letter detailed everything: how her grandmother had worked as a midwife in the 1960s, helping wealthy families cover up unwanted pregnancies; how she had falsified records, arranged illegal adoptions, and in some cases, made problems disappear entirely. The hidden room had been her archive, her insurance policy against the powerful people who had used her services. But the most devastating revelation came in the letter's final paragraphs. Sarah's own mother had been one of those babies, not born to the woman Sarah had always called grandmother, but stolen from a young, unwed mother who had trusted the wrong person with her secret. "Your real grandmother died in that room," the letter continued, "and I have carried that guilt every day since. The medication I gave her was supposed to ease the birth, but something went wrong. I panicked. I took the baby, your mother, and raised her as my own. I told myself I was saving her from a life of shame and poverty." Sarah's vision blurred as she read the final lines. "The genetic condition that runs in our family, the one affecting your pregnancy, it doesn't come from us. It comes from her. I have included her real medical history in this collection. Perhaps it will help you save what I could not." The cabin felt like it was spinning around her. Everything she thought she knew about her family history, her genetic makeup, her pregnancy risks, all of it was built on lies and death. She thought of Dr. Morrison's warnings, his concern about hereditary complications, and realized he had been working with incomplete information all along. Her phone buzzed insistently. Marcus again. She had been ignoring his calls for hours, unable to face explaining what she was discovering. But now, with this letter in her hands, she felt a desperate need to hear his voice. "Sarah, thank God," he said when she answered. "I've been trying to reach you all day." "Where are you?" "I'm still at the cabin." "Marcus, She stopped, unsure how to begin explaining the magnitude of what she had found. "Listen, something's happened. I've been doing some research on your grandmother like you asked, and I found something disturbing. There's a police report from 1967 about a missing person case. A young woman named Elena Vasquez disappeared after going to see a midwife about her pregnancy. The midwife was never identified, but the timing and location match my grandmother perfectly, Sarah finished, her voice barely a whisper. How did you know that? Sarah looked around the hidden room, at the boxes of secrets, and the letter that had just shattered her world. Because I found Elena's medical records, and Marcus. I think Elena was my real grandmother. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice tight with concern. Sarah, you need to get out of there. Now. If what you're saying is true, if your grandmother really did kill someone and steal their baby, then these records are evidence of murder. And if the wrong people find out you have them... A sound from the main cabin cut him off, the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She was certain she had locked that door. Someone's here, she whispered into the phone. Stay hidden. I'm calling the police and heading your way. Sarah ended the call and quickly switched the phone to silent. She could hear footsteps moving through the cabin above, slow and deliberate, as if the intruder was searching for something specific, or someone. She gathered the most important documents: Elena's medical records, her grandmother's confession letter, and several birth certificates that might be crucial evidence, and stuffed them into her jacket. The rest would have to stay behind. The footsteps stopped directly above the hidden room. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself against the far wall. Then she heard a voice, muffled but familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. I know you're here, Sarah. We need to talk about what you've found. The voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it that made Sarah's skin crawl. This wasn't a random break-in. Someone knew exactly what she had discovered, and they had come to ensure she couldn't use it. The footsteps resumed, moving toward the kitchen, where the entrance to the hidden room lay concealed behind the false cabinet. Sarah realized with growing horror that whoever was up there knew about the secret room. They knew because they had been here before. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie stillness that seemed to press against the cabin walls. Sarah sat on the floor of the hidden room, surrounded by scattered papers and photographs, her phone clutched in her trembling hand. The conversation with Dr. Hendricks replayed in her mind like a broken record, the tremor in his voice when she'd mentioned her grandmother's name, the way he'd hung up so abruptly. Marcus paced behind her, his footsteps creating a rhythmic counterpoint to her racing thoughts. We need to get out of here, he said for the third time. Whatever your grandmother was involved in, it's bigger than we thought. Sarah's eyes fell on a manila folder she hadn't opened yet, tucked beneath a stack of birth certificates. Her name was written across it in her grandmother's careful script. With shaking fingers, she pulled it free and opened it. Inside were ultrasound images, but not hers. These were dated 26 years ago, around the time of her own birth. Below them, a medical report bore her mother's name. Sarah's breath caught as she read the clinical notes describing complications during pregnancy, experimental treatments, and a series of injections administered during the third trimester. Marcus, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Look at this. He knelt beside her, scanning the documents over her shoulder. His face grew pale as he read. Sarah, these treatments, they're similar to what you've been receiving. The same drug protocols, the same monitoring schedule. A cold dread settled in Sarah's chest. She flipped through more pages, finding similar files for other women, dozens of them, spanning decades. Each pregnancy carefully documented, each child tracked through their early years. Some files ended abruptly with death certificates. Others simply stopped, as if the subjects had vanished. At the bottom of her mother's file was a handwritten note. Subject 23, viable offspring, full genetic integration achieved. Continue monitoring through second generation. The words swam before Sarah's eyes. Second generation. She pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the familiar flutter of movement within. They've been planning this, she said, her voice breaking. Whatever they did to my mother, they're doing to me. Marcus pulled out his phone, but the screen showed no signal. The landline, he said, moving toward the main room. We need to call someone. The police, the FBI, anyone. Sarah remained frozen, staring at the photograph that had fallen from her mother's file. It showed her grandmother standing with a group of people in white coats outside what looked like a medical facility. In the background, she could make out a sign, Blackwood Research Institute, Advancing Human Potential. The name triggered a memory, her grandmother mentioning Blackwood during one of their last conversations, something about old friends and important work. Sarah had assumed she'd been rambling, lost in memories of her nursing career. Now she realized it had been something far more sinister. A sound from outside made her freeze. Car engines, more than one, approaching through the muddy mountain road. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "The phone line's been cut." They moved to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. 3 black vehicles were winding their way up the driveway, moving with deliberate purpose despite the treacherous conditions. "Dr. Hendricks," Sarah breathed. He told them. Marcus was already gathering the most important documents, stuffing them into a backpack. "There's got to be another way out of here." Sarah remembered exploring the cabin as a child, finding the old root cellar that connected to a network of storage spaces her grandfather had dug during the Depression. "The basement," she said. "There's a tunnel that leads to the old storm shelter about 100 yards into the woods." The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the clearing. Through the window, Sarah could see figures in dark clothing spreading out around the cabin, moving with military precision. One of them she recognized, Dr. Morrison, her own obstetrician, the man who had been monitoring her pregnancy so carefully. The sight of him here now confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't just about her grandmother's past. It was about her baby, and whatever twisted legacy they were trying to perpetuate. Marcus grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the basement stairs. "Whatever happens," he said, "we keep that baby safe." As they descended into the musty darkness below, Sarah heard the front door being tested, then the sound of splintering wood. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor above them, multiple voices calling out search patterns. They moved through the basement by feel, Sarah's childhood memories guiding them to the hidden entrance, behind her grandfather's old workbench. The tunnel beyond was narrow and damp, barely tall enough for them to crawl through. Behind them, the footsteps had found the hidden room. She could hear papers rustling, furniture being moved, voices growing more urgent. Soon they would find the basement entrance. Sarah pulled herself forward through the tunnel, one hand protecting her belly, the other clutching the backpack of evidence that might be their only hope of survival. The laboratory felt sterile and cold beneath the fluorescent lights as Sarah sat across from Dr. Martinez, her hands trembling as she gripped the envelope containing the DNA results. 3 weeks had passed since she'd submitted the samples, her own blood, hair from her grandmother's brush, and tissue from the preserved specimens she'd found in the hidden room. "Are you ready for this?" Dr. Martinez asked gently, his weathered face creased with concern. He'd been her grandmother's colleague decades ago, one of the few people who remembered the research conducted at the cabin. Sarah nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to run. The baby moved restlessly in her womb, as if sensing her anxiety. At 7 months pregnant, she could no longer ignore the strange symptoms that had been escalating, the heightened senses, the accelerated healing, the dreams that felt more like memories. Dr. Martinez opened the envelope with deliberate care. His expression shifted as he scanned the results, and Sarah's heart sank at the confirmation she saw in his eyes. "The genetic markers are unmistakable," he said quietly. "Your grandmother wasn't just documenting her research, Sarah, she was documenting her family. Your bloodline carries modified DNA sequences that don't occur naturally." The words hit her like physical blows. "Modified how?" "Enhanced cellular regeneration, improved immune responses, accelerated neural development. Your grandmother was brilliant, but she was also desperate. The research indicates she was trying to create a genetic line that could survive some kind of catastrophic event." Sarah's throat constricted. "And my baby?" "The modifications appear to be amplifying with each generation. Your child's genetic profile shows enhancements that are unprecedented, "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued, his voice heavy. "The tissue samples you brought, they're not from failed experiments. They're from your relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins you never knew existed, people who didn't survive the modifications." Bile rose in Sarah's throat. The preserved organs, the careful labels, the meticulous records, they were a graveyard of her own family members who had died for her grandmother's obsession with creating the perfect human. "My mother?" Sarah whispered. She was the first successful subject, but the psychological trauma of learning the truth. He trailed off, but Sarah understood. Her mother's supposed mental illness, the sanitarium, the early death, it had all been the price of discovering what had been done to her. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the parking lot. Normal people went about their normal lives below, unaware that monsters walked among them. Monsters like her grandmother, monsters like herself. "Can it be reversed?" she asked, without turning around. "I don't know. The modifications are integrated into your DNA at the cellular level. But Sarah, you need to understand, there are people who know about this research. People who have been looking for your family line for decades." She spun around. "What people?" "Government agencies, private research corporations, groups that would see your child as either a weapon or a threat. Your grandmother went into hiding for a reason. She knew what she'd created couldn't be allowed to fall into the wrong hands." As if summoned by his words, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know what you are. We know what you're carrying. Come home to the cabin. Come alone." Dr. Martinez saw her face pale as she read the message. "What is it?" She showed him the phone, and his expression darkened. "You can't go back there." "They have David," she said, realizing the truth even as she spoke it. Her husband's business trip, the lack of communication, it hadn't been coincidence. "That's why I haven't heard from him. Sarah, this is exactly what your grandmother feared. These people won't hesitate to dissect you and your baby to understand the modifications." But Sarah was already moving toward the door, her mind racing through possibilities. The cabin held more than just records. It held her grandmother's research notes, her methods, possibly even reversal procedures, and it held the only leverage she had to save David. "I have to go back," she said, "but not alone, and not unprepared." Dr. Martinez grabbed her arm. "This isn't a game. These people have resources you can't imagine." "So did my grandmother," Sarah replied, her hand moving protectively over her belly. "And she left me everything I need to finish what she started, one way or another." The baby kicked hard, as if agreeing, and Sarah felt something shift inside her. The prey was becoming the predator, and the final confrontation was waiting in the mountains where it all began. The laboratory stretched before Sarah like a cathedral of science, its sterile white walls humming with the quiet efficiency of machines that never slept. Dr. Elena Vasquez led her through corridors lined with specimen containers and monitoring equipment, each step echoing the weight of the questions that had driven Sarah here in the middle of the night. "The preliminary blood work confirms what you suspected," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice carefully neutral as she pulled up results on a large monitor. "The genetic markers are unusual. I've never seen anything quite like this combination." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the life growing inside her had become both miracle and mystery. The documents from her grandmother's hidden room had painted a picture of scientific experimentation spanning decades, but seeing the evidence in her own blood made it terrifyingly real. "What exactly are you saying?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew. Dr. Vasquez highlighted sections of the genetic analysis, her finger tracing patterns that looked more like abstract art than medical data. "Your DNA contains sequences that shouldn't exist naturally. They appear to be artificially introduced modifications, probably through retroviral insertion techniques that were experimental even 20 years ago." The room seemed to tilt around Sarah. She gripped the edge of the lab bench, her knuckles white against the black surface. "And the baby?" "Shows the same modifications but amplified, enhanced." Dr. Vasquez paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sarah, whatever was done to your family line, It's been passed down and is now expressing itself more strongly in the next generation. Through the laboratory windows, dawn was beginning to break over the city, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Sarah thought of her grandmother, of the meticulous records hidden behind that false wall, of Dr. Morrison and his colleagues who had treated her family like lab rats for generations. "There's something else," Dr. Vasquez continued, pulling up another screen. "I found traces of a monitoring compound in your system, something that would allow remote tracking of your biological functions." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "Someone's been watching me?" "The compound is recent, introduced within the last few weeks." Dr. Vasquez met her eyes with a look of professional concern mixed with genuine fear. "Sarah, I think you need to consider that whoever was behind the original experiments might still be active." The implications crashed over Sarah like a wave. Dr. Morrison's death hadn't ended anything. It had simply driven the operation deeper underground. Someone had been monitoring her pregnancy, watching as their decades-long experiment reached its next phase. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number." The words on the screen made her stomach clench with terror. "The baby belongs to us." "Come home, Sarah." Dr. Vasquez saw her reaction. "What is it?" "No." Sarah's voice was stronger than she felt. "Running won't solve this. They'll never stop, will they? Not as long as the baby and I represent their life's work." She thought of the cabin, of the hidden room where her grandmother had kept her desperate records. Eleanor had known this day would come, had prepared as best she could by preserving the evidence, but evidence alone wouldn't be enough. "I need copies of everything," Sarah said. "All the test results, the genetic analysis, the monitoring compounds, everything." Dr. Vasquez nodded, already moving to compile the data. "What are you planning?" As Dr. Vasquez worked, Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. The scientific community would be horrified by the evidence of unauthorized human experimentation. The media would ensure the story reached every corner of the world. But first, she needed to survive long enough to tell it. Sarah stared at the words, understanding the choice they were offering wasn't really a choice at all, but they had made one crucial mistake. They still thought of her as a victim, as another generation of their docile test subjects. They had no idea what a mother would do to protect her child. "Dr. Vasquez," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "I need you to do something for me. If I don't contact you by tomorrow morning, I need you to release everything we've found to every major news outlet and medical journal you can think of." The doctor's eyes widened. "Sarah, you can't seriously be thinking of going to them." Sarah was already moving toward the door, the flash drive containing their findings secure in her pocket. "I'm not going to run anymore. This ends today." Sarah's hands trembled as she held the birth certificate that would change everything. The name, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, stared back at her, but the parents listed weren't the ones who had raised her. Her grandmother's signature appeared in the corner as the attending midwife, dated exactly 28 years ago. The hidden room seemed to close in around her as the truth crystallized. She wasn't just Margaret's granddaughter, she was her daughter. The woman she'd called grandmother had given birth to her in secret, then orchestrated an elaborate deception that had lasted nearly 3 decades. Footsteps echoed from the main cabin, and Sarah quickly stuffed the documents into her jacket. Dr. Elena Vasquez appeared in the doorway, her face grave. "I've been looking for you," Elena said, her eyes scanning the scattered medical files. "We need to talk." "About what? About how my entire family has been lying to me?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "About how I've been carrying a genetic time bomb because no one told me the truth?" Elena stepped into the room, carefully avoiding the papers strewn across the floor. "Your grandmother called me yesterday before she died. She knew you'd found this place." "She knew?" Sarah felt the walls spinning around her. "She knew I was here, going through her secrets, and she said nothing?" "She said everything she needed to say. She left you a letter." Elena pulled an envelope from her coat pocket, Sarah's name written in Margaret's distinctive handwriting across the front. Sarah's fingers shook as she tore open the envelope. Margaret's voice seemed to whisper from the pages as she read, "My dearest Sarah, you're reading this. You've discovered what I've hidden for so long. I was 17 when I had you, the result of something I've never spoken about and never will. My parents, your grandparents, couldn't bear the shame, so we created a story. My sister Helen, who had been trying for years to have a child, became your mother. I became the doting grandmother. The genetic condition that runs in our family, Wilson's disease, it's real, and it's why I kept all these records. I needed to track every birth, every case, to protect future generations. Your pregnancy terrifies me because I know what you don't. The baby's father carries the gene too. I've watched you for 28 years, loving you from a distance that should never have existed between a mother and daughter. I've made terrible choices, but I made them out of love and fear, the same emotions that are probably overwhelming you now. Dr. Vasquez has the complete medical files. Trust her. Trust the tests. But most importantly, trust yourself to make the choice that's right for you and your child. I love you more than you'll ever know. Margaret. Sarah's legs gave out and she sank to the floor among the scattered papers. She was my mother. All this time, she was my mother. Elena knelt beside her. The genetic testing results came back this morning. I've been trying to reach you. Sarah looked up, afraid to hope. And your baby doesn't carry the gene. The combination that worried your grandmother, it didn't happen. Your child will be healthy. The relief hit Sarah like a physical blow. Tears she'd been holding back for days finally came, washing away weeks of terror and uncertainty. Healthy? You're sure? Completely sure. The advanced testing is definitive now in ways it wasn't when your grandmother was tracking these cases manually. Elena helped Sarah to her feet. She did the best she could with the knowledge she had, but medical science has come so far. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked around the hidden room one final time. Decades of secrets surrounded her. Birth certificates, medical records, family trees mapping genetic inheritance through generations. Margaret had been a guardian of knowledge and secrets, protecting her family the only way she knew how. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now you decide what to do with the truth. You can share it or keep it private. You can be angry or find peace with it. Your grandmother's gone, but your story is just beginning. Sarah picked up a photo from the scattered papers, Margaret holding a baby, both of them squinting in bright sunlight. On the back, someone had written Sarah, age 3 months. The love in Margaret's eyes was unmistakable, even in the faded photograph. She never got to be my mother, Sarah whispered. She never stopped being your mother, Elena replied gently. She just loved you from a different role. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Sarah took one last look at the hidden room. Tomorrow she would have to decide what to tell her husband, what to tell the rest of the family, how to process a lifetime of redefined relationships. But today she was simply grateful for her baby's health, for Margaret's love, and for finally understanding the weight of secrets that had shaped her entire life. The afternoon sun streamed through the cabin windows as Sarah stepped outside, carrying both the burden and the gift of truth.